Okay, welcome back. Next up, we have Dr. Kazez from SMU. And I would like to say that in addition to her bio that she has in your program, I would also like to point out that she maintains a blog called In Living Color. And I noticed yesterday when I was blog stalking her that she does actually give some links associated with her talk today. And if you're like me, once you start looking at her blog, your reading list is going to get bigger and bigger, and you will realize, like me, that you will probably not live long enough to read everything that she has suggested. I do know that she is also involved in, as far as community work, she is involved in Amnesty International, and I'm sure she would love to answer your questions about getting involved in that. I first met Dr. Kazez about a year ago when we both did talks for the Fellowship of Free Thought about women in free thought, and after having dinner with her the night before, I basically went on her advice, went home and rewrote a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, and I found her to be a very well-researched and engaging speaker at the time. And I also fully admit to, you know how some people judge their president by who they want to have a beer with? I judge people by, can I enjoy a glass of wine with you? And she did very, very well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kazez.
Thank you very much, and I enjoyed the glass of wine with you. Let's see. I'm going to be talking about, well-meaning of life, a big topic. But I'm aware this is a women's conference, and there are all sorts of things going on the internet about women's issues. And so before I plunge into this gigantic issue of meaning of life, I wanted to just quickly address the women's issues. I did give a talk that was 100% about women's issues for Fellowship of Free Thought a year ago, and so I didn't want to just do that again. But I want to talk a little bit about solidarity between women versus agreement. I think solidarity is really important. It's just saying, I am a woman. I am a woman skeptic. I'm a woman in many things, actually. Those are some of the things. And I think sticking up for other women and being part of the group is really important. Watching this sort of craziness on the blogosphere lately, have been reminded of an experience I had when I was 13 years old. I had the idea to host a talk on women's liberation, as we called it back in the 60s, at my junior high school. And, well, that seemed like a good idea. I mean, in the 60s, when women have terrible problems now, well, they had mammoth problems in the 60s. Well, my best friend, Ellie, thought this was a terrible thing to do. And she didn't just want to be uninvolved. She rebelled against this to the point where she broke off our friendship. And the interesting thing about it was that she was from a very progressive family. Her father was a leader in the anti-war movement. So this was a very unexpected attitude. And furthermore, it's interesting how she made her case. She said, I'm not going to support this women's liberation stuff because what about the Native Americans? There was this thought that if there's some other problem in the world, then we cannot pay attention to women's problems now. I think that's a very pernicious way of thinking about things. You know, we can pay attention to women's problems, even if there are other problems in the world. And I think another thing that's been brought to my mind by the craziness in the blogosphere is the personal nastiness of the way she dealt with me. I remember this very, very vividly. She sent me a nasty note, ripping me to shreds, and partly based on an appearance issue. I had this sweater when I was 13 years old. It was a fantastic sweater. It was a purple sweater, and it was long and sort of like a tunic, and it was really cool. well, she went after my purple sweater. That really hurt, you know. I persevered. I sponsored that program. We had our women's liberation lecture, and so there. You know, keep calm and carry on. But okay, now let's talk about the other thing, agreement. I think we did not need to all agree on practically anything, you know, to have solidarity with each other as women. We do not have to agree about even things like harassment codes, and we do not have to agree on 8 plus. We can disagree on a huge amount, but we should. I really believe passionately we should still have solidarity with each other and identify ourselves as women in this atheist movement. You know, stick up for each other. And I think that the more that we allow disagreement, the more women will be willing to feel solidarity. So, you know, some just won't, and it's not our fault. It's just them, you know, and their fixation with my purple sweater or whatever. But allowing a sort of disagreement is good for bringing in the most people we can, feeling solidarity with other people. Okay, now, moving right along to the meeting plan. Okay, so what I'm really going to be talking about today is a new book called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. I can barely read this without, I should have had it last joined by, I probably need my reading glasses. Would you want to, they're in my version. Thank you. Okay, so this is a new book in which the philosopher Alex Rosenberg argues that life is meaningless. Now, he's cheerful about that. He doesn't want us to kind of pull up, you know, tear out our hair and get depressed. He thinks it's okay that life is meaningless. And I'm going to be arguing that life is actually not meaningless. But before I do that, I'm going to have to give you a bunch of background on this whole issue of God and the meaning of life and a bunch of other stuff. Okay, so let's start with a real-life existential crisis, because it's better to start with sort of real people than abstractions. So take Tolstoy. He was age 51 in 1879, and he had already written War and Peace and Anna Karenina. He had a wife who loved him and 9 children, you know, little ones in the house even. He was famous, he was rich, he lived on a huge estate. He sort of was the man who had everything. And he suddenly had this big crisis, and he started thinking, everything comes to an end, my life is meaningless, I may as well be dead. So he's sort of literally suicidal, starts casting about, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to restore my sense of life having meaning? And what happened is he started kind of looking around at the peasants on his estate, and started to think that, well, these people are not tearing up the hair and sort of moaning and groaning. These people have a sense that life is meaningful. They're not all preoccupied with death. What's the difference between them and me? So he concludes, the difference is that they have religious faith and I don't. So he starts wanting to have faith. Now, the interesting thing here, and the puzzling thing is, how does he get religious faith? Because he's a rationalist. He actually finds most religion just silly. His writing is just full of just mockery of religion. But he wants it because he thinks that this is the only way his life is going to become meaningful. Somehow, basically, and this is kind of strange and interesting, but the way he comes to believe is he kind of goes out into his estate and kind of hangs out with the peasants. He sort of sits next to the cobbler and makes shoes, learns how to make shoes. He goes out and does some farm work with the farmhands, and somehow, big somehow, the faith kind of by osmosis, he just really gets it. And at that point, he doesn't just say, oh, good for me, my life is meaningful now. He starts to believe in the necessity of faith. So he writes in this book, A Confession, only in faith can we find the meaning and possibility of life. Faith gives an infinite meaning to the finite existence of man, a meaning that is not destroyed by suffering, deprivation, or death. Okay, so here he is, after his conversion, pondering the infinite. You know, how does this help? Well, he thinks that, you know, during life and after life, we have this connection to the infinite. So it's just not true that everything comes to an end. You know, the body dies, but we go on forever. And even in life, our efforts are kind of connected to God. And so he kind of, through faith, overcomes this anxiety he has about mortality and impermanence. Okay, so now let's look at sort of standard atheist response to this idea of the necessity of faith for meaningfulness. Standard of atheist response is no, no. No God, and no necessity of God for meaningfulness. And the standard way of backing that up is to make the distinction between the meaning of life and meaning in life. So for there to be a meaning of life, well, that would be sort of a cosmic purpose, and there would really have to be a deity to give human existence this cosmic purpose. And so, yeah, for the meaning of life, you do need God. But meaning in life is just having your own plans, your own goals, your own ultimate aims. And for that, you don't need God. So the standard atheist response says, you know, take somebody who's a passionate climber and sort of lives for climbing. Well, that person has meaning in life, you know, no need for God to back that up. Or take Michelle Obama, who said at the Democratic National Convention recently that her daughters were the most important thing in her life. Okay, so she has meaning in life, no need for God, you know, as a foundation for God. Or take Hillary Clinton. No need for God. That's a woman with a meaningful life. Just no need for God. Okay, so on this view, that meaningfulness, the most important kind of meaningfulness is meaningfulness in life, and you don't need God for that. Tolstoy's problem was that after he had written all his books and got so rich and, you know, so much fame, he kind of ran out of goals. He didn't have something, he didn't have the next thing, you know, to aim for. And so what he needed was not this connection to the infinite, but just more fulfilling goals. So that's the standard atheist response to the idea that faith is necessary for a meaningful life. So, problem solved, done. We can move on, think about something else. I'm pausing so you can ponder my word. Okay, enter trouble. I hope a lot embarrass my daughter if I tell you that when she and her brother were kids, we told stories all the time, and we called spiky stories. And in a spiky story, it's about a little spider. And in a spiky story, things get interesting when a certain character named Trouble enters the story. Trouble, you know, messes things up, makes something interesting happen, and creates the drama, etc. So Alex Rosenberg is Trouble in my story. He's going to mess things up. Rosenberg asks, can there really be meaning in life? And he argues that, but there cannot. Meaning in life is only possible if Hillary has thoughts about peace. Michelle has thoughts about her daughters. The mountain climber has thoughts about mountains. Now, you might think, well, yeah, sure, no problem. What's the big deal? But aboutness is problematic. So let me just pause and I'll tell you. Okay, so think about, well, let's say this is Michelle Obama's brain, just for fun. But I said it was mine, but we'll pretend it's Michelle Obama. So her brain weighs, I don't know, 2 pounds. I just came up with that, weighs 2 pounds. It's spongy. It's wet. It has electric charge. These are the straightforward physical properties of the brain that are just not problematic. These are factual properties that are sort of part of reality in a completely unpuzzling way. Now, what we want to look at is the idea that her brain also has aboutness. So the states of her brain are about her daughters. Now, that ought to sound a little more strange to you. Being spongy, well, that sounds plainly physical and not problematic, but being about, think about that, you know, is there really aboutness kind of out there in the physical world? It seems like it. I mean, you're all looking at me right now, your brains have various physical properties, you appear to be thinking about me. I mean, it really does look like it. But aboutness is a very odd property to think of as being out there as part of the physical world. Now, I think in the world of atheist intellectual debate, lots of things have been discussed at great length. Obviously, is there a God? Are there souls? Is there really a self? Is there free will? Is there objective morality? But aboutness is another problematic feature of the universe. And that's what Rosenberg wants us to think about. Ouch. You know, in his book. Okay, if you do think about aboutness, you get into some really weird problems, which we'll come back to in a second, or later on. Okay, now just to give you a little background, Rosenberg is not the first person to bring up this issue of aboutness. There is a whole, about 100-year history of thinking about this issue. There are lots of major philosophers who have written on this. There's a mammoth literature. But I think what Rosenberg is doing is he's sort of bringing this issue to the attention of atheists. He's taking a stand that aboutness is not just a little weird. It actually just doesn't exist. It's just not real. Aboutness is not real in the way that souls are not real, fairies are not real, witches are not real, ESP, heaven, destiny, whatever. It just does not exist. So, the mountain climber cannot think about mountains. Michelle cannot think about her daughters. Hillary cannot think about world peace. You cannot think about me. Now, that means that life is just plain meaningless because, according to Rosenberg, there's no meaning of life because God does not exist, and there's no meaning in life because there is no aboutness. We cannot have all these thoughts about our lives and about our goals and so on and so forth that would be involved if there were meaning in life. So that sounds really bad. Thus scream, tear out your hair, jump off a cliff. But no. Rosenberg thinks, no big deal, just not a problem. Just get over it, It's just, you thought life was meaningful. It turned out God doesn't exist, so it's not meaningful in that way. There's no aboutness, so it's not meaningful in that way either, but just no problem. Well, what about Tolstoy, though? I mean, he was really upset about it. Give the man some Prozac. That's what he literally says in the last chapter of the book. Give the man some Prozac. He's depressed. Get over it. Not a problem. Okay. Now, let's think about this. Now, you want to know, presumably, why does he think there is no aboutness? So look at his argument more closely. He thinks, and there's lots of different arguments in his book, and it's a fun book. I recommend reading it. I have a review of the book in the current issue of Free Inquiry, and I'm not too kind about it, but it's an interesting book worth reading. Even just because it's sort of fun to disagree with things. But anyway, so he argues that aboutness is unreal for various reasons. So here's one thing he talks about. That if you say that, let's suppose somebody's in Paris thinking about Paris, or they're landing in the airport and they're looking out at the scene and they seem to be thinking about Paris. Are they really thinking about Paris? One worry he has is that Paris is very, very diffuse. So if you think somebody's thinking about Paris, well, what parts of Paris are they thinking about? Are they thinking about Paris, just 10 feet above the ground, or 20 feet, or half a mile, or a mile, or all the way up to the moon? Or so where does it end, this object of thought? What about the rats in the sewers? Is that part of the thing they are thinking about? So objects of thought are very diffuse and ill-defined, and so that's one problem. Another problem, maybe a deeper problem, is that he argues that neurons are just too simple to be about anything. Sea slugs have them, rats have them, frogs have them. They're just circuitry. When you really look at how they work, it's just a bunch of circuitry, and you just don't get aboutness, this sort of connection to things out there in the world from these circuits. I mean, if I right now try to think about Mount Everest, it's really far away, and my neurons are right here, sort of clicking away. There's something very problematic about thinking that neurons have this aboutness connection to all sorts of things out in the universe. Now you might think, oh, well, not just one at a time. To get aboutness, you have to have a whole bunch of them working together. But he says piling up neurons just doesn't help. Piling up a lot of neural circuits that are not about anything at all can't turn them into a thought about stuff out there in the world. Okay, so if there's a problem with one, there's a problem with a whole bunch of them. So, no aboutness. Okay, now you might be thinking, why should I care about this? I'm here as an atheist. I don't care about these problems in the philosophy of mind. Really, why should I be, what is there about me that makes it necessary for me to pay attention to this argument? So Rosenberg says that the real source of atheism is scientism. Now, some people think of scientism as sort of a dirty word, something to be avoided. He thinks it's a good word, it's something to be embraced. And on his account, scientism is the view that the physical facts fix all of the facts. So we all agree that the world is made up of these basic elements, particles or whatever, and those particles just establish certain physical facts. But they also establish more facts. So take the fact that you are either male or female. That's not just a basic thing about the physical universe, but the physical facts do make you male or make you female. But there are other things that would seem like facts, but just aren't fixed at all by the particles. These things that just float free of physical facts entirely are unreal, illusory, just not to be taken seriously. Okay, so if you start from scientism, you will wind up saying he thinks no God, but you'll also say no soul, no heaven, no destiny, all kinds of things are going to get thrown in the trash if you start from scientism. But he thinks that it's also true that there is no aboutness if you start from scientism. So your own starting point as an atheist will lead you to this no aboutness view, and that's why you particularly are in trouble with it because of this. That's why you in particular have to pay attention to this reasoning. Okay, so that's all his view. All right, so let's now think about how we should respond. There are lots of possibilities, and let's just start with, okay, it's just a nut. I mean, it's just silly. Let's not even pay attention to this. This is stupid. Let's just move on and go on. Let's talk about something more important. I'm not too keen on the idea of just dismissing it as a nut, because a lot of philosophical views seem nutty at first. There is no soul. I that's nuts. You know, there is no heaven, there is no God, there is no free will. All these things seem just nuts initially. So let's not go with dismissing as a nut. Second option, and actually let me just pause for a second. I'm trying to kind of race through all this because I want to have time for discussion. Philosophy is really about discussion and debate. If we don't have any discussion and debate, I will feel sad. So I'm pushing through here, and this is the area of my talk where you might want to be thinking, you know, which option would I choose? And I'd be interested in knowing that at the end of the talk. You know, you might even think, are you a number oneer, a number twoer, a number three? Were there going to be 6 options? Okay, so agree but secretly. I think this no aboutness thing is just a public relations disaster. I mean, atheists already have a problem being accepted in society. Imagine that Alex Rosenberg decides to run for political office, and he's asked some philosophical questions. Vote for me, even though I think God doesn't exist, life is meaningless, and nobody has thoughts about anything. What a disaster. You know, so I think that even if you did agree with him, you might want to go along with this sort of keep it a secret option. But I would be very dissatisfied that that's all I could say. So he's right, but you know, that's just not a satisfying philosophical response. All right, next possibility, dismiss Rosenberg's view as self-defeating. Here he is saying, I am not thinking about anything or talking about anything. Well, that sounds horrible and crazy and stupid, but think about this carefully. If there is no aboutness, is his view defeated? Not really, because to be defeated, it has to say something that's false. Okay, so if his view is correct, then what he's saying in the speech bubble there is just noise, but it doesn't say something that's false. Okay, so I think what we really want to claim is that he's saying something there that is false. And so what I'm really looking for here is a way to refute him, and this is just the self-defeating thing is just not going to work. Okay, next possibility: reject scientism. This is a little complex strategy that involves several steps. First step: come to atheism by another route. You don't really need to embrace scientism to be an atheist. For example, you could just be an atheist based on the argument from evil. You know, this is kind of a world full of bad stuff, and it's sort of obvious that this world was not created by an omnipotent, all-good God. So there cannot be a deity of that sort. So I think that kind of argument will actually quite persuasively establish the non-existence of God, and you didn't even have to sign on for scientism. Next step in that strategy would be to say that, okay, so you threw out scientism. Next step would be to say that there are genuine facts that flow free of physical facts. So we really don't need to understand how aboutness is generated by the physical brain. And so you can just sort of accept aboutness as a floater, so to speak. Something that's real, but is not generated by the physical brain. Okay. There's a lot to think about there, but I don't like that option because the aboutness of your brain affects how you behave. So if your number one priority, like Michelle Obama's, is your daughters, is your children, you're going to actually behave differently than if your number one priority is world peace or whatever. And so these states of mind that have aboutness have an impact on our behavior and on the physical world. And so if we think of them as just sort of floating free in the physical world, we're going to have a bit of a mess on our hands. We're going to have a very incoherent view of reality. So even if scientism is not 100% true, I don't think we want to abandon the search for a physical basis for aboutness. All right, so that didn't work out so well. Next option is, let's just rip his arguments to shreds. I don't think they're very good arguments. They're not very powerful. You just look at the parallel there. What he's saying about aboutness is not really all that persuasive. It's like saying piling up a lot of atoms that aren't conscious can't make me conscious. Well, that's not a very good argument, actually. The problem is with this strategy is that I think once he starts trying to get us to worry about aboutness, it's like we sort of got stung, and we're going to itch, we're going to scratch, and we want to understand what aboutness is and how it does emerge from the physical world. And I don't think we can, we want to just tackle that, not just avoid the problem by picking on his batteries. Okay, so what else can we do? We really want to just go for the challenge that he's giving us. What is aboutness, he's asking us? How does it actually emerge from the physical brain? Now, here's my problem. I want to kind of give you a little glimpse of what philosophers have said about this, but the sad fact is that they've been talking about it for, the last 3 decades, and there's a gigantic pile of literature, and it's all very complicated. So I'm going to give you just a little glimpse, of one approach to this, and not at all try to give you details. Okay, so take a frog that has the ability to detect flies in its environment. The brain of the frog has states that correlate with things going on in its environment. That's simple, that's visible, that's straightforward. Because arguably, that's just all that aboutness really is. It's just correlations between what's in the brain and what's in the environment. And just, that's all over the place. Creatures that have brains have those kinds of correlations because that's how we evolved, and that's how we managed to adapt, and live and just survive in our environments. So this basic idea of detection is the heart of the matter. And we can apply that to the human case easily. To think about Harris is just how Harris detected is all really something really quite simple and straightforward, and that we can understand as being part of the world. It's not fluffy, weird soul stuff. It's nothing real spooky. It's just having a pair of detectors. Now, it gets a little weird because of the fact we can all actually sit right here thinking about Paris, and we're not detecting Paris. So that's a little problematic. And so a lot of the literature about this is about, how to account for that. But the basic idea is that once you get yourself a Paris detector, it can fire at whenever you want it to. You can lie in bed in the middle of the night thinking about Paris. It's still a Paris detector. It's about Paris, but it has that ability to be deployed in all kinds of situations. All right, let's just hope that that story works. I believe something like that works. And on that view, hooray, we're back in business. Michelle has a daughter detector. She has thoughts about daughters. The mountain climber has a mountain detector. It gets a little hairy. We mean a world peace detector. What are you talking about? It gets very hairy, really spelling out the details there. But that's the basic idea. And let us just say, probably prematurely, this is sort of like the George Bush, the famous George Bush moment, but mission accomplished. We've now explained intentionality. All right. Now, that's all the kind of big picture metaphysics, religion stuff I want to talk about. But I also want to talk more concretely about meaning in life, because if we've kind of defended it and met Rosenberg's challenge, I think we still want to know the details. So what do you really mean by that? What are the elements of meaning in life? And, how can I get some? Okay, so let's get a little more concrete here. I actually teach a course on the meaning of life. I've been teaching it for 10 years. So this is not one of the, I think your stereotype of what philosophers do is this kind of thing. It's actually not so common to do this kind of thing. But there is a lot of literature on the meaning of life, especially in the last decade or so. And one of the best books out there is a book called Reasons of Love by Harry Franker. This is just a wonderful book that I would recommend to anybody, very readable and wise. So one element of meaning in life is love, according to him. He says that a loving gives us a sense of their intrinsic importance and sort of gives us motivation. So love saves us from squandering our lives with activist activity that is fundamentally pointless. Love makes it possible for us to engage wholeheartedly in activity that is meaningful. So if you really love something, it gives you that sense of wholeheartedness so that you don't just want to do whatever you're doing, but you want to do it. You care about it. Another element is suggested by the philosopher Susan Wolf in the book Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. She says meaning arises from loving objects that are worthy of love. So simply loving them is not enough. They have to be worthy of your love and engaging with them in a positive way. Meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness. Everybody's sort of nervous here. Objective attractiveness, well, what she means by that is that she thinks an activity is objectively attractive when two conditions are met. The benefit is not received only by me, but shared by others too. So in a meaningful life, we're not just after our own good, but a bigger, more general good. And the benefit is not seen only by me, but real, factual. It's not just in my mind. The benefit is something that I can explain to others and defend to others. That has to be sort of real. A third element of a meaningful life, it seems to me, is that in a meaningful life, we don't just engage in lots of different activities, but we have goals that give shape to our lives. So if you were doing something you love and that's worth doing on Monday, and then something completely different on Tuesday, and a third thing on Wednesday, and there was sort of no unity in your life, it seems like, well, yeah, you'd have a lot of meaningful activities, but you wouldn't have a meaningful life. Okay, so that's the third element. And now I'm just going to really just crazy because I want to have time for discussion. So let's now, before sort of combining all those things, let's think for a minute about what is meaningless. And I'm going to take some examples from online life, both because I have too much online life, I would say, and it makes me wonder about what is meaningful and what is meaningless. And also because I recently read a book I thought was just excellent, Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, about how online life sort of drains some of the meaning out of life. So here's some examples of meaningless activities. And I choose these examples really in a kind of looking at myself kind of way, and not in a I'm disapproving of you kind of way, just to make that clear. But checking email and Twitter endlessly. Oh my goodness. The interesting thing about that is that you want to do it, but do you want to do it? No, it's often that you want to do it, but you also at the same time want to not do it. You do not love it. You do not care about it. No, so maybe you do, but I don't. Okay, so there's some problem there about what we really care about. Malicious online bullying. If you really were to sit down and think about it, whether that was worth doing, whether it had objective value, I do not think it would come out to be true that it was a valuable way to spend your time. Endless chatter at blogs. It sort of fragments your life so that your activities on Monday don't build anything. It's just more and more and more of the same thing. So now let's not just end on a note of, aren't we terrible, but talk a little bit about what adds meaning to our lives. A couple of examples, and I think there's lots and lots and lots of things, and I don't want to be sanctimonious here about, but raising children, working for social justice, but also sort of doing anything that involves a lot of skill and development of talents. So the mountain climber is in my pictures for a reason. Because there's something about that sort of honing of ability and achievement that seems meaningful, even though it doesn't have quite the, it doesn't have quite the credentials. It doesn't have quite the image of raising children with social justice. Let me just end by coming back to Tolstoy. On this view about meaning in life that focuses on love, objective worth, and giving shape to life, it's interesting to come back and think about Tolstoy and his sense that his life had no meaning that drove him to religion. Interesting enough, his life actually had all of the elements of meaning when he had this crisis. And one could argue that his life was meaningful at that time, and he just didn't know it. And you might actually also think about what it is that stopped him from knowing it. One thing was sort of religion that was around him as kind of the obvious answer, but also sexism, because he had that crisis. And this always kind of amazes me. He had that crisis at a time when there were 9 children in the house. 9 children, including newborn babies. And there's really nothing like a newborn baby to make you feel like that really matters. I have goals. And I want to just sort of mention who it is in my reading list I'm about to give you who makes that case most eloquently. It's actually Harry Frankfurt, not the woman on my reading list, Harry Frankfurt. So I don't think this idea of the importance of parenthood is not just a woman's point, it's a man's point too. But since in the 19th century, the women would have been sort of on the other side of the house, being taken care of by the nurse and the mom, and they Tolstoy just didn't have the option of seeing the meaning in that. That wasn't available to them. Okay, reading list is here, but it's also at my blog with links to everything that I've mentioned. And so, goody, we have 15 minutes for discussion.
I was thinking about what Rosenberg had to say about neurons, saying that it's a dumb circuitry that has no aboutness. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, I think aboutness is some kind of association between 2 symbols. If you read a sentence and it's a definition, if you think about what's it a definition of, and so you process the symbols in the sentence, and you figure out it's a definition of this other word. So I think the real question is, can neurons make associations between one symbol and another? I think that the learning process of neurons associating the firing with one neuron with another neuron that has the capability to create associations between things.
Well, I think that's fairly unproblematic. And it's true that connections between symbols are important for the content of our thoughts. But to have thoughts that are kind of about things in the real world, like Paris, the mere connections between 2 neurons, it doesn't seem like it's going to kind of get out there to the things that we seem to have thoughts of.
The first step is that our senses and that the data that we see and touch is encoded into firings of neurons. They turn into patterns in our brain. So the patterns of letters on the page become patterns of firings of neurons.
Yeah. But how do you get out there to like a moon? If you're thinking about the moon, how do the connections between neurons and the associations, how does that get you up? It seems like associations, but you've got to somehow get a connection between the brain and the world for thoughts to be about the world. But I think that's what you're talking about is a very important part of mental content, but doesn't quite establish about this. Yeah.
My question is also related because I'm an undergraduate student in psycholinguistics. This is really cool.
Okay.
And it seems like Rosenberg is working some of the how nothing can exist concretely because our brain is switching away, fluid.
And there's a lot of talk like that.
Everything, just like you said,
what I said about detection was completely individualistic. It's just a matter of correlation between what's going on in my brain and what's in the world. But there is this possibility that's kind of a social element, keeping all of that in, doing some work as well. So, yeah, yes, that's one view. That's all I can really say. Yes, that was one.
We just want to make sure we get your questions on the microphone, so I'm going to be passing them around the audience.
Okay, let's see. Yep.
Oh, yeah, I can.
Oh, okay. We're coming up. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so a lot of times as an atheist, it's an assumption that you have no moral compass, and because you don't believe in God, you have no purpose or meaning to go in that thing. But as a teacher of philosophy, I'd be interested in what you think as far as intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for atheist students, especially teaching at SMU. I wonder how all that works together. But I know, like with Dan Pink and stuff, with motivation, right? Autonomy and mastery and all those things all lead to purpose. And of course, you touched on purpose there. So I was wondering, how do you engage with your students to kind of tap into that intrinsic motivation? Although you may not have to work that hard with philosophy students for that, but I'd be interested.
Well, SMU is Southern Methodist University, in a kind of, I think, fairly, vestigial way. It's not really a religious. It is not a religious school. And in fact, it's interesting. I'm teaching a course on the meaning of life right now, and I started with Tolstoy and the whole idea of the necessity of faith. I like to have debate in my classes. I don't want to have a religious student, pounding the table and saying we have to have God for meaning. And I could not find one person who would do that. It was very disappointing. And I think in many philosophy, what? Yeah, I really enjoy that sort of debate. So it was sad. I think in many of the classes I teach, I really don't find that sort of a lot of religious outlook. But okay, maybe I'll just leave it there because I love a bunch of other people with their hands up. Yes? Okay, sorry. Yeah. You have to really get so serious when you come all the way up to the front. Okay.
As a recovering philosophy student,
Yes. You'll be okay.
this sort of feels like he's like basically reposing the problem of dualism with aboutness and meaning in thought being kind of Descartes, where Descartes has to bring in God to tie things back to the real world.
This is interesting because I think for the public and for atheists, who chew on all sorts of difficult philosophical questions, what has come to people's attention is the problem of consciousness and how it is that the lights are on in my head, and that's like a big problem of about the mind, and it's the view that led Descartes to think that there was a soul.
It feels like the world is dualistic.
But there is a second problem in the philosophy of mind, which is, maybe been the most heavily worked on problem in the last several decades, and it's the problem of intentionality, the problem of aboutness. This really is. When I was in graduate school 20 years ago, everybody was working on aboutness and not on consciousness. So what's, I think, kind of really useful about Rosenberg's book is he's bringing this chunk of the philosophy of mind to the attention of the atheist community. And it's really an interesting problem.
They're all interesting problems.
Yeah, they're all interesting problems. So you're recovering from, as a philosopher,
I'm recovering.
Yeah. What are you doing to recover? Are you reading a lot of trashy novels or what?
I've switched to, I'm working on being an artist. So I figure if I can't philosophically solve the philosophical problems, I can art about them.
I applaud you. Let's see. Yeah. Whoops.
I'm bothered about I'm sort of bothered about the whole idea that neurons
whole bunch of neurons. Well, a computer basically is 1 and 0. Everything that a computer does, from our most elaborate ones down to a basic calculator, is based on 1s and 0s. All living things have incredible input devices, sensory devices. We become self-programming computers in a way that take those neurons and program them from the time that the neurons start dividing.
Yeah. I think that is really a bad argument in Rosenberg, that whole bit about how, you know, piling up little simple things can't get you anything more complicated at a larger level. I think that's just a bad argument. But yeah, I think that's just weak. So, yes, I agree with you. Let's see, where are we here? Do you have a sense of who needs to be called on? Because I don't know. I've lost track. And I'm really sorry, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, we could have a line.
Well, it just says, yeah, okay. With your offerings.
We're not gonna like the one.
You're agreeing. All these questions are just fantastic. I'm really delighted.
Well, mine was more of a comment only because it's sort of an answer to Rosenberg. Naively, I read Consciousness Explained. I'm the kind of person who reads teleology for fun, which is very sad. But, so recovery, yeah, I'm in total denial. I read Consciousness Explained and then read Kinds of Minds and was just so intrigued with intentional stance. I actually wrote a lieutenant a letter about that very issue. And he gave me a list of other books, including Wetware by Dennis Gray. The actual current research has shown that it's not just neurals. Dennis Gray initially studied ants, but that has led to a lot of research on how the brain works and how those language centers in the brain, they literally do make an imprint. So there's your aboutness, because there are literal imprints by way of symbols in language. Yes, so that when you say Paris or daughter, there's a specific meaning to me when you say the word daughter, because I have a daughter. So that whole question that he brings up is moot, because research has already proved that inaccurate.
Well, now an interesting thing about Daniel Dennett, by the way, is that he did really make his name in philosophy of mind working on exactly this problem of intentionality and aboutness. But as far as the idea that, well, science has just sort of solved this problem, I don't think that's really true, and I think if science has something to teach us about this problem. But one of the tricky things is to understand this connection between the mind and the world. Because it's not just all stuff happening within your cranium. There is this connection between me and the moon, or me and Paris, or me and my daughter, that is crucial to aboutness. And I think to understand that, you're not going to be able to understand that purely in terms of these internal connections. As much as they might have some relevance to it, but they're not going to be the whole story. By the way, I should say, Alex Rosenberg is a philosopher of biology, written a mammoth amount of stuff in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, not a naive person at all. So he's perfectly familiar with all this literature and all this relevant science, but he thinks it's a failure. He thinks that we will just never have a satisfactory naturalist account of aboutness. So it's not because he hasn't tried or that he hasn't looked, but he thinks there's something sort of basically amiss with all the angles, all the attempts.
Yes. I'm a geologist, a scientist, and when I hear philosophers talk, I think you are way obsessed with human beings who are just one other animal. These neurons firing create consciousness that we see in plants and other animals. It's something that arises There are animals that are altruistic. You see all these properties of consciousness emerging in animals, and I think the philosophers are too obsessed with human beings.
Well,
And-
first of all, can I just cut you
Yes.
off right now? Okay, I'm going to do that. Because I happen to be the author of a book called Animal Kind. And aside from teaching my course on the meaning of life for the last 10 years, I've also taught a course on animals for the last 10 years. And one chapter of my book is about animals and animal consciousness. And sure, by all means, interesting stuff. There's no reason at all why our philosophizing about the mind should be limited to human beings. Of course not.
Yeah, I'm a biologist, so maybe this is where I'm kind of not quite finished. Talking to the mic, sorry. Isn't he kind of ignoring the idea of emergent properties? When he's saying that he's just got a bunch of simple little things, it's not just piling on more and more atoms, it's also how they're arranged. Of course, like in chemistry, we take basic H2 oxygens. Then you have emergent physical properties when you put them all out together, arrange them, and wet, new, all these other things.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat now and defer to my colleague Justin, who teaches philosophy of biology and may know what Rosenberg thinks about emergent properties. Do you know what he thinks?
No,
Speak into the microphone, Justin.
I'm not sure. I'm going to strangle somebody. Sorry. I'm not sure what Alex thinks about emergent properties. But yeah, definitely this is the sort of idea that you say, there's something fishy about this argument. Say, well, each of the parts doesn't have this property, so the whole can't have the property.
Right, that's just bad.
Each of the parts of your podium isn't a podium, but put all those atoms together, you do get a podium. And so that argument's got to be flawed.
That's just a
That's
bad
a question
argument.
about whether putting neurons together that create something with aboutness.
Right. Yeah, how do we, what's the recipe? I mean, what do we have to put together? What do we have to, if we want to cook up some aboutness in our kitchen, what are we going to have to do? I mean, is it just going to be neurons, or are we going to have to get those neurons to correlate in certain ways with things going on in the world? There is a difference of opinion about that in philosophy. I've sort of explored in my presentation. Some people think that the connection to the world is important. They think that content, aboutness is an externally established thing. Some people think just what's in the mind is important. It's a narrow internal thing. I've kind of cast my lot with the externalists in this talk. But as far as emergence goes, that's like a really tricky, fuzzy, difficult question, and I'm just not sure. Even if we signed on for it, I'm not sure if it would help in saying to solve this problem.
Speaking of emergent properties, first of all, I have to apologize to you and the entirety of the SMU philosophy department. Well, for having perpetuated fraud some 12 years ago, writing a paper for one of your students for money.
Are you serious?
I did. And I give y'all credit, your professors were the only one. And I really also apologize if this was you teaching a course on, there were people asking ethical questions about abortion, because that's what the paper was about. I give them credit because they were the only ones who ever caught us doing this, but we still managed to make plausible deniability and so on. It was a lot of money. For karma, I became a teacher later.
This is maybe the most surprising comment I could possibly
Well, I'm just saying,
wow.
Better people can...
I knew what to do, but the question about animals, I haven't.
I just need to say, better people can emerge from not so good people. Eventually, it took me 12 years, but I was wrong about a lot of things back then. I thought I was a guy. You discover shit. And,
I find it extremely interesting. You just
anyways, what I wanted to bring up actually, and I didn't know how much you read in about, say, Lacanian psychoanalysis or that kind of thing, and there's this theory, though he was full of shit in a lot of different ways, about the mirror and children having a primary crisis of encountering their image in a mirror and beginning to first understand that there is something that is not. There are things which exist which are not them or are not a part of them. That it's somehow a belief that a child intrinsically at first appreciates or understands all things as connected to them in a primary narcissism. Don't know if it's true. But interesting idea is that so much of our common law, right, even if they disagree on the fine points of things like, say, age of consent or age of being able to serve the military and that kind of thing, a lot of it's predicated on the notion that people have to reach a certain level of vaguely ill-defined maturity in order to be able to make certain decisions about their own selves. And I think when you were talking about this idea of, well, Paris is so far out there, I think the younger, not younger, but the more immature perhaps you are in your ability to distinguish this and that, even your hand is as far away as Paris. Understanding it as hand, understanding your body, and considering the relationship many of us have to our bodies with self-loathing or that kind of thing, especially, I mean, I'm sure many of the women in here can relate to this, of hating what this is, even though it is yours, even though it belongs to you, but being taught to hate it, comes from a lot of that notion. So this idea of aboutness, my first instinct was, oh, we're going to get Dasein, we're going to get, is that new?
No Dasein. Not interested in Dasein.
Screw him. Instead, I'm thinking about this and go, most of us continue to operate with as if we understand somehow naturally, without this language to articulate it, that there are difficulties with aboutness, that there are disagreements with aboutness, but we're negotiating them daily because we have to, and because aboutness is a fact. It's a crisis that provokes this. And I think this talk about neurons, I think this talk about language and all this other stuff, as well as social practices, along with our disagreements. Like that podium, we use this as an example. If I were 2 feet tall, that's not a functional podium. Does it still count as a podium?
Taking the bit about, at what point is there aboutness? I'm sort of starting to work on a book about children and parenthood, and one issue that I'm really thinking about, is just at what point do children start having a connection to the world as something out there beyond themselves? Because you might argue that aboutness is something that you're not just actually born with, but the way you relate to the environment and think about the world gradually creates this connection to outside things that creates aboutness. Yes, I think that's those are details to be thought through.
So I was asking about what kind of a naturalistic account would you really want to see in order to accept that, yes, we have thoughts which are about objects in the real world. And my first question was about, well, okay, we can make associations between symbols inside our cranium. And you came back to the point, well, look, where do we turn objects in the real world into symbols? Would you accept some account of the way that we analyze the raw data from our senses and turn it into just a list of objects that we see as symbols in our cranium? Is that the kind of account that you like?
I think what we want is like really, what philosophers try to do is come up with a claim like X is about Y if and only if you put something on the other side. And it's got to be something that's sort of straightforwardly physical and not spooky and doesn't involve non-natural objects. And you kind of sort of try to list these conditions that create, that make it so that a brain state is about Paris. If you can state those conditions in non-spooky, physically respectable terms, that's an explanation. The problem is that if you really go to work on that and fill your head with painful thought experiments and counterexamples, it's not easy to do that. It's actually very, very difficult to do that. And that's why Rosenberg thinks there's a difficulty. But this is kind of one of those things where it sounds easy. But it's kind of like, baking a souffle. Well, it sounds easy. Just put it in the oven and it'll rise. But it's actually not easy. So there's a certain amount of just trying this kind of project that is necessary to see what the hardness, what it is that's difficult about it.
That sounds like,
I'm sorry. It's like anything that.
In some ways, that kind of sounds like the problem with saying what other words some other sentence is about. To listing the words that you need to say, what order they have to be in, that's a complicated grammatical study, and it takes a study of the entire English language for anybody to say why.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing this as an issue about connections between words, but one about it's an issue of connections between things in the head and things in the world, and how that connection gets established, and what elements have to be there for the thing in the world to be about, the thing in the head to be about the thing in the world. But you're thinking about maybe linguistics. Yeah. But you know what I think is an important, we're going to probably end in a second, but I think one point I just want to end with is that one of the things, I think 95% of philosophy, maybe not 95, but a lot of philosophy is just seeing what the problem is in the first place. And I think that it really takes a lot of work to get yourself really troubled by the issue of aboutness. And so I think to some extent in this talk, I haven't maybe done quite enough to make you very, very, very anxious about how it fits into the physical world. Because it sounds, well, it's easy, but there's actually, I think, a very deep puzzle there that's not easy to solve. Yeah, one last question. I'll give you a final word. It's interesting that all the questions have been about this and not about the meaning of
The assumption that aboutness exists, and the assumption that you go with all that, why isn't life still meaningless? Why isn't aboutness an attempt to provide a framework of meaning to a life that ultimately could be meaningless because it's just one of many that continues on?
Yeah, well, that's why I went into, in the last part of the talk, I went into conditions, because I think just because you are a person who has thoughts about things, that isn't all there is to having a meaningful life. That's just a necessary condition. You could spend your whole life, counting the blades of grass in your front lawn, and you'd be having thoughts about the grass, and you wouldn't have a meaningful life. So that's why we have these extra conditions having to do with love, objective worth, and the shape of life as a whole. So now you ask a good question, but I think there's a question there like, okay, let's add all those conditions together. Do you really get meaning out of all of that? I think that one could still wonder about that. It's not an open and shut case.
Meaning to who?
Meaning to who? Yeah.
If I were counting all the blades of grass, that would have meaning to me, perhaps not to you.
Yeah.
Now you're speaking of meaningfulness within a social context that can change in 10 years.
Well, the view I put forward and kind of embraced had was slightly tinged with arrogance that you may have noticed, because it says that just loving something is not enough. It needs to be worthy of being loved. That's the condition that Susan Wolf added in. If you love being an online bully, it's not a meaningful thing to do because it's just objectively not worthwhile. Now, of course, you can ask yourself, well, what the hell makes something objectively worthwhile? And that's hard. It's another of those $64,000 philosophy questions. But my gut feeling is with Susan Wolf that just loving it doesn't make it so. There is this element of, is it really worth it? Okay.
I, for one, wouldn't mind keeping the discussion going, but I think some of our younger natives are restless and hungry. Maybe some of our older natives as well. So parents, please pick up your children, and we will see you back here promptly at 2 o'clock for what atheist women really want to know.